If you drive anywhere in the United States, February 2026 could quietly become one of the most expensive months of your life. Not because of gas prices, not because of car payments, but because a set of new driving laws is about to flip the rules of the road in a way most drivers still don't see coming. These changes weren't debated loudly. They weren't rolled out with warnings on nightly news. They moved fast behind closed doors, and they were designed to do one thing extremely well: catch violations at scale. Technology will be doing the watching, systems will be doing the calculating, and the penalties won't be small. Starting in February 2026, 5 new rules will begin taking money directly out of drivers' pockets, often without a police officer ever pulling you over. Hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. In some cases, compounding penalties that don't stop until you comply. What makes this moment dangerous isn't just the rules themselves. It's how suddenly they're being enforced, how quietly they were finalized, and how unprepared most drivers are right now. Because by the time many people realize what changed, the fines will already be active, the notices already sent, and the damage already done. For months before this became public, the warning signs were there for anyone who knew where to look. Transportation analysts noticed something unusual happening in Washington. Meetings were taking place behind closed doors. Federal agencies were coordinating with technology companies in ways they hadn't before. Enforcement budgets were being redirected toward departments that had been underfunded for years. Even more telling, the usual pushback from automotive and insurance lobbyists went silent. And when transportation policy goes quiet at the federal level, it almost always means the decision has already been made. My name is Sophia, and I've spent years tracking how regulatory shifts like this actually affect everyday people. Not in theory, but in real life when the bills arrive. What made this moment stand out wasn't just that new driving laws were coming. It was how fast everything lined up at once. State DMVs began quietly adjusting their codes. Insurance companies updated internal risk models. Law enforcement agencies started purchasing new monitoring technology before the public ever heard a word. This wasn't gradual reform. This was preparation. And preparation at that scale only happens when enforcement is about to accelerate. The question was never whether new driving rules would arrive. The real question was how aggressive they would be, how much money they would extract, and whether drivers would realize what was happening before February 2026 made compliance non-optional. By early summer, the timeline finally became clear. February 2026 wasn't chosen at random. It was the moment federal systems would be fully synchronized, state enforcement agencies would be operationally ready, and automated monitoring networks would go live nationwide. This wasn't a soft rollout. This wasn't a pilot program. Federal transportation officials described it internally as an activation phase. That language matters because activation means enforcement begins immediately, not after months of warnings. By February 2026, every state will be aligned with the same baseline standards, the same verification systems, and the same penalty structures. And once that switch flips, there is no grace period built in for confusion or ignorance. Officials have already confirmed that within weeks of the start date, active monitoring will begin across all 50 states. Not the occasional traffic stop most drivers are used to, but continuous technology-driven oversight, the kind that doesn't miss a lapse, doesn't forget a violation, and doesn't offer discretion. What makes this especially concerning is how few drivers are aware of what's coming. Recent surveys show that fewer than a quarter of licensed drivers can even identify one of these new rules correctly. That gap between enforcement readiness and public awareness is exactly where financial damage happens, because the systems don't wait for people to catch up, they simply start issuing penalties. What also makes February 2026 different from past regulatory changes is how enforcement itself has evolved. For decades, traffic laws relied heavily on human intervention. An officer had to observe a violation, make a judgment call, and initiate a stop. That process naturally limited how many violations could be enforced. These new rules removed that limitation almost entirely. Enforcement is no longer bound by manpower or visibility. It's built into infrastructure. Cameras, sensors, databases, and automated verification systems will now handle tasks that once required discretion. That shift changes everything. A brief insurance lapse that might have gone unnoticed for days now triggers an automatic fine. Slowing down only when you see a camera no longer works when your average speed is being calculated over miles. A glance at a phone that once depended on an officer's observation can now be detected by fixed systems that never blink. This is why officials have described the changes as transformative. They're not just updating penalties, they're redefining how compliance is measured. And when compliance is measured continuously, violations become inevitable for anyone who isn't prepared. The financial implications of that reality are enormous. Experts estimate that unprepared drivers could face anywhere from $500 to well over $10,000 in penalties in the first year alone, depending on how many systems they trigger. That's not speculation. Those figures are already written into federal and state traffic codes. This is the point where driving in the United States shifts from casual compliance to constant accountability, and the drivers who feel that shift first will be the ones who assumed nothing had really changed. The first rule takes aim at something most drivers never think about, even though it's already inside their vehicle. Beginning in February 2026, mandatory event data recorder compliance becomes a fully enforceable requirement. If your vehicle was manufactured after 2018, it is expected to have an event data recorder, often called an EDR, in verified working condition. This device is not optional, and it's no longer treated as background technology. It becomes an inspection item. If the system is malfunctioning, disconnected, or shows signs of tampering, the penalty is immediate. The base fine starts at $750, and that's before any secondary consequences are considered. What makes this rule especially powerful is how it connects enforcement agencies and insurance companies. Event data recorders capture precise information about how a vehicle was operating just before an incident, including speed, braking, and throttle input. Starting in February 2026, insurers are granted expanded access to this data during claims and investigations. That means driving behavior is no longer a matter of interpretation, it's documented. For years, drivers assumed these systems existed mainly for crash analysis. Now they function as accountability infrastructure. They prove exactly how a vehicle was driven, and they remove ambiguity from fault determinations. For drivers who haven't checked whether their vehicle's system is functioning properly, this rule creates an invisible risk. You won't know there's a problem until an inspection, a claim, or a roadside check triggers it. And by then, the fine is already attached. This is the moment many drivers realize that modern vehicles aren't just transportation anymore. They're evidence. The second rule is the one transportation officials expect to generate the highest volume of penalties in the shortest amount of time. Real-time insurance verification becomes fully active nationwide in February 2026, and it fundamentally changes how coverage is enforced. The familiar ritual of handing over an insurance card during a traffic stop is effectively obsolete. A national verification database now connects law enforcement systems, toll infrastructure, and automated license plate readers in real time. Every scan checks your coverage instantly. If your policy has lapsed even for a single day, the system flags it automatically. There is no warning period built into this process. The first offense triggers a $1,000 fine. A second offense escalates to $2,500 and includes mandatory license suspension. What makes this rule especially dangerous is how common short lapses actually are. Missed payments, billing, errors, or delays when switching providers are more frequent than most drivers realize. In the past, those gaps might have gone unnoticed unless an officer asked for proof at the wrong moment. Now, the system is always checking. It doesn't care why the lapse happened. It only verifies whether coverage exists at that exact moment. And once a violation is recorded, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. This is where many drivers will get caught off guard, not because they chose to drive uninsured, but because they assumed a brief gap wouldn't matter. Starting in February 2026, it matters immediately. If staying ahead of changes like this helps you avoid costly mistakes, make sure you're subscribed because the rules are shifting fast and missing one detail can be expensive. The third rule is the one that pushed safety advocates to demand faster enforcement, and it's also the one most drivers underestimate until it happens to them. Cell phone detection technology becomes fully enforceable in February 2026. And it doesn't work the way people assume. These aren't just red light cameras with better lenses. There are advanced systems installed at major intersections and along busy corridors that analyze hand position, device placement, and screen illumination inside moving vehicles. They can tell the difference between a phone resting in a cup holder and a phone being actively used. They can detect the posture associated with texting, scrolling, or holding a device near eye level, and they operate continuously. There is no officer discretion involved. The first violation carries a $500 fine. The second jumps to $1,000 and includes a mandatory distracted driving course. The third triggers a 90-day license suspension. By the end of the rollout, more than 300 metropolitan areas will have these systems active with expansion planned beyond that. What makes this rule especially punishing is how normalized phone use has become behind the wheel. Many drivers don't consider quick glances to be violations. Many assume enforcement only happens when an officer witnesses it directly. That assumption no longer holds. These systems don't issue warnings, they issue notices. And once a violation is recorded, contesting it becomes difficult because the evidence is visual, time-stamped, and automatically logged. For drivers who rely on muscle memory more than intention, this rule alone could generate multiple penalties in a short period of time. It's not about whether you think you are being careful, it's about whether the system detected behavior it's programmed to flag. The fourth rule changes something drivers have relied on for decades without even realizing it. Speed enforcement is no longer about a single moment. Beginning in February 2026, average speed monitoring zones expand across federal highways and major corridors. Instead of measuring how fast you were going at one point, cameras now record your entry time and exit time between two locations. Your average speed across that entire stretch is calculated automatically. If it exceeds the posted limit, a violation is generated. Slowing down when you see a camera no longer protects you. The entire distance is monitored. This rule catches drivers who maintain speeds just slightly above the limit for extended periods, not just those who spike their speed briefly. Violations start at $300 and escalate to $800 when the average exceeds the limit by more than 15 miles per hour. What makes this especially effective from an enforcement standpoint is that it removes the gamesmanship drivers have learned over years of traditional speed traps. There's no guessing where the camera is. There's no timing, a slowdown. The system only cares about the math. And because the calculation happens after the fact, drivers often don't realize they violated the rule until the notice arrives in the mail. For commuters who travel long distances daily, this rule quietly increases exposure to repeated fines. A habit that once felt harmless can suddenly become expensive. This is the point where many drivers realize that enforcement is no longer reactive. It's analytical, and when enforcement becomes analytical, consistency matters more than momentary behavior. The fifth rule completes the enforcement picture, and it's the one with the most severe long-term financial consequences. Beginning in February 2026, emissions compliance is no longer limited to scheduled inspections or repair shop visits. New roadside emission sensors will begin operating passively, meaning they can detect non-compliant vehicles as they drive past without ever stopping. These systems analyze exhaust output in real time and compare it against federal standards. If a vehicle fails, a violation notice is automatically generated and mailed to the registered owner within 72 hours. The initial fine starts at $400, but that's only the beginning. Once flagged, the vehicle enters a compliance window. Repairs must be completed and verified within 30 days. Miss that deadline and daily penalties of $50 begin accumulating. These penalties don't pause, they don't reset. After 90 days, registration suspension becomes automatic. That means the vehicle is no longer legally drivable, even if everything else is in order. What makes this rule especially costly is that many drivers won't know they're out of compliance until the notice arrives. Older vehicles, modified exhaust systems, and deferred maintenance all increase risk. Repairs to bring a vehicle back into compliance can easily exceed $2,000, especially when emission systems are involved. This turns what used to be an occasional inconvenience into an ongoing financial threat. The longer a driver delays action, the more expensive the situation becomes. This rule isn't designed to encourage compliance gently, it's designed to force it quickly. And this is where the impact becomes uneven, because not every driver absorbs these changes the same way. Transportation analysts and consumer advocates have been clear about who faces the greatest risk under these new rules. Lower income drivers, households with older vehicles, and people who rely on driving for daily work will feel the pressure first. A newer car with factory-fresh systems and stable insurance coverage is far less likely to trigger multiple violations. An older vehicle with deferred maintenance, aging sensors, or emissions issues is far more exposed. The same is true for insurance. Drivers living paycheck to paycheck are more likely to experience short coverage gaps, even if unintentional. Under the old system, those gaps might never have been noticed. Under the new system, they're instantly penalized. What makes this especially concerning is how penalties compound. One violation often leads to another. An emissions issue leads to registration problems. A registration problem leads to higher insurance costs. Higher insurance costs increase the risk of coverage lapses. This cycle doesn't just punish non-compliance, it traps drivers financially. And that's why critics argue these rules represent more than safety reform. They represent a shift in how driving privilege is enforced using financial pressure as the primary tool. For drivers who are already stretched thin, preparation isn't optional. It's the difference between staying mobile and being priced off the road entirely. As these rules began filtering into state systems, the ripple effects showed up almost immediately. DMV offices across the country reported a sudden surge in calls, appointments, and online inquiries as drivers tried to figure out whether they were compliant. In some states, wait times jumped by nearly 50% in a matter of weeks. Insurance companies, seeing what was coming, started adjusting risk models quietly, announcing premium increases for drivers with any moving violations. In the past 3 years, auto repair shops in major metro areas reported a sharp rise in emissions testing and electronic diagnostics bookings, many of them scheduled months in advance. This wasn't coincidence. It was a system reacting all at once. When enforcement, insurance, and compliance infrastructure move in sync, it signals something more than routine regulation. It signals intent. Federal authorities didn't just change the rules, they aligned every downstream consequence to reinforce them. For drivers, that means one violation doesn't stay isolated. It follows you, it affects insurance costs, it affects registration status, it affects your ability to legally drive. This kind of coordinated pressure hasn't been seen at this scale since the early days of mandatory seatbelt laws, when enforcement and penalties were used to force a cultural shift in driving behavior. Back then, many drivers resisted until fines made resistance too expensive. The same pattern is emerging again, only now the tools are more precise and far less forgiving. What this moment really marks is the end of what many drivers unconsciously relied on for years: casual compliance, the assumption that enforcement would be inconsistent, that some things would slide, that short lapses or minor habits wouldn't matter much. Beginning in February 2026, that mindset becomes dangerous. Federal standards now override state-level inconsistencies. Real-time verification replaces periodic checks. Passive monitoring supplements active enforcement, and penalties stack faster than ever before. The system no longer waits for you to make a big mistake. It captures small ones repeatedly, and small ones, when automated, add up quickly. Many drivers believed emissions only mattered during annual inspections. They believed insurance only mattered if an officer asked. They believed technology couldn't really tell what they were doing behind the wheel. Every one of those assumptions is now outdated. The era of casual compliance is ending, not because drivers suddenly became reckless, but because enforcement became constant. And when enforcement is constant, preparation becomes the only defense. This isn't about fear. It's about reality. Driving in the United States is entering a new phase, one where accountability is built into the road itself, and ignoring that shift is no longer affordable. What makes this shift especially difficult is the timing. These rules are arriving at the moment when many American households are already under serious financial strain. Vehicle prices are high, repair costs are higher, insurance premiums have been climbing steadily. For millions of drivers, a car isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, tied directly to work, family obligations, and basic independence. When regulatory changes happen during periods of economic pressure, they don't feel like safety improvements. They feel like new threats to already fragile budgets. A $400 fine isn't just a penalty, it's groceries. A $1,000 insurance violation isn't just a warning, it's rent. And when those penalties stack, when daily fines begin to accrue, the stress compounds quickly. Transportation officials may frame these rules in terms of safety and compliance, but drivers experience them in terms of cost. And that disconnect matters because when people feel cornered financially, they're more likely to delay repairs, stretch insurance payments, or hope problems go unnoticed. Under the old system, that sometimes worked. Under this one, it doesn't. The system isn't designed to overlook hardship. It's designed to detect non-compliance regardless of circumstance. That's why consumer advocates are sounding alarms now, not after February 2026 arrives. They understand that prevention is far cheaper than penalties, and that awareness is the only buffer drivers have left. The message coming from federal transportation agencies once you strip away the formal language is unusually blunt. Compliance is no longer optional, and patience is limited. Officials have stated plainly that ignoring these regulations is incompatible with responsible vehicle ownership. In bureaucratic terms, that's as close as you get to a warning without saying the word warning. Historically, that tone only appears when enforcement agencies are confident in their tools and prepared for backlash. And they are. Enforcement budgets are in place, technology contracts are signed, data systems are live. This isn't an experiment, it's a shift in posture. Billions of dollars in potential fines are now built into traffic codes nationwide. And those funds don't come from corporations or agencies, they come from drivers. That's why this moment feels different. It's not just about obeying the law, it's about understanding how aggressively the law will now be applied. For years, many drivers believed enforcement would remain fragmented, inconsistent, and human. February 2026 marks the moment that belief stops being true. The system is unified, it's automated, and it's watching continuously. The only real choice drivers have left is whether they enter this new era prepared or whether they learn about it the hard way through penalties that arrive without warning and don't disappear once they do. In response to these changes, consumer advocacy groups and transportation attorneys have been unusually direct. They've warned that these 5 rules are structured to catch people who wait. Not reckless drivers necessarily, but busy drivers, stressed drivers, drivers who assume they'll deal with it later. Because later is exactly when the penalties begin to multiply. A missed repair deadline turns into daily fines. A suspended registration turns into insurance complications. An insurance lapse turns into license suspension. Each step narrows options and raises costs. What's especially telling is how many professionals are urging drivers to act before February 2026, not after. They know that once enforcement begins, systems won't slow down to accommodate learning curves. Grace periods will be minimal, appeals will be difficult, and most violations will already be backed by digital evidence. Attorneys tracking early implementation say enforcement agencies are fully staffed, fully funded, and under pressure to demonstrate results. Rolling out all 5 rules simultaneously wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. When multiple compliance requirements change at once, it overwhelms complacency. It forces behavior change quickly. That's the theory behind aggressive compliance acceleration, and it's the model being used here. Drivers who understand that strategy have an advantage. They can prepare calmly. Drivers who don't often feel blindsided. The uncomfortable truth is that drivers aren't powerless in this moment, but they do have a narrowing window. Preparation now looks very different from reaction later. It means verifying that insurance coverage is continuous with no gaps. It means checking whether a vehicle's event data recorder and emission systems are functioning properly before a violation forces the issue. It means understanding how average speed zones and automated monitoring actually work instead of assuming old habits still apply. These steps aren't dramatic, but they are protective. They shift a driver from being reactive to being informed, and informed drivers don't generate revenue for enforcement systems. Unprepared drivers do. That's why this moment matters so much. February 2026 isn't just a date on a calendar, it's a dividing line. On one side are drivers who adjust early and absorb minimal cost. On the other are drivers who continue as usual until notices start arriving. What happens next depends almost entirely on awareness. Federal authorities are watching compliance rates closely. Insurance companies are watching claims and violations, and households are watching their budgets. This is the point where small decisions made now determine whether driving remains affordable in the months ahead. Because once enforcement begins, the system won't ask whether you knew. It will only check whether you complied. What we're seeing now is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a much tighter enforcement era. Transportation officials have already signaled that February 2026 is only the first phase. As compliance data comes in, enforcement priorities will be adjusted, refined, and expanded. Systems that start in major metropolitan areas will move outward. Thresholds that begin conservatively can be lowered. Penalties that feel heavy now can be increased later. This is how modern regulation works. It doesn't arrive all at once and stop. It arrives, measures behavior, and then adapts. That's why officials are watching driver response so closely. They want to see whether awareness leads to compliance or whether penalties become the primary motivator. For drivers, that distinction matters. A system that sees high compliance rates tends to stabilize. A system that sees widespread non-compliance tends to tighten the next 30 days before enforcement fully ramps up are not just about avoiding fines. They're about shaping what enforcement looks like going forward. Households that prepare early reduce pressure across the system. Households that don't increase it. And when pressure increases, so do costs. This is why February 2026 should be understood as a turning point, not just another regulatory update. It marks the moment when driving in the United States becomes inseparable from constant verification. Technology enables accountability. Accountability enables enforcement, and enforcement, when automated, produces financial consequences quickly and consistently. Drivers who verify compliance now will likely remember this period as a close call they navigated successfully. Drivers who ignore it may remember it as the moment driving became unexpectedly expensive. The difference between those outcomes isn't luck, it's awareness. The rules are written, the systems are live, the penalties are defined. What remains undecided is how prepared drivers will be when enforcement accelerates, because once February 2026 arrives, there will be no ambiguity about what changed. The only question will be whether you adjusted in time or whether you're learning about these rules the first time through a violation notice. Preparation separates those who stay in control from those who pay, and right now, preparation is still possible.